Hey guys, Joel here, aka One Flying Solo, and today I wanted to expand on something I mentioned in a video I posted yesterday in the 3 tips for coping with anxiety. One of the things I mentioned in that video was learning to identify maladaptive thought processes. So if you Google maladaptive thought processes, you'll come up with a list of categories of thought processes of, types of thoughts, strings of thoughts that are in some way not helpful, maladaptive. So I wanted to go over a few of those. There have been entire books written about this, but I know sometimes it helps to hear from somebody who's experienced it personally. I'm not an expert, but I've lived it, so I felt that it would be helpful to share with somebody maybe who could benefit from it. So one of the categories you'll see, and each author or doctor or book will call it something slightly different, but they're pretty much the same. So one of the categories is called all or nothing types of thoughts. And so it's those of us with anxiety, you tend towards perfectionism, I'll put it that way, and we're very hard on ourselves. So for example, an all or nothing thought would be like, if I don't do this perfectly, like if I'm a student, if I don't get a 100%, or if I don't get an A in this class, I'm an idiot. And that's an example of all or nothing, because the reality is that if you get a passing grade, then that's okay. But when you have the all or nothing thought process, you judge everything like it has to be 100%. And if it's not, you're a complete failure, right? And that's not reality based. That's not rational, because we know that this is life, man. Nothing's 100%, right? So if you can learn to see it for what it is, we live in a very nuanced, shades of gray kind of a world, right? We don't live in an all or nothing world, but we tend to fall into that trap sometimes. I have. So that's one category that I've struggled with a lot. Another one is called global labeling. And what global labeling it basically says is, if I've had one bad experience, like relationships, for example, if I've had one bad relationships, then all relationships are bad, right? So you're taking like a couple experiences that you had that are bad, or even good experiences even, and you're just saying that the whole category is bad. And that's false. We know that's false. How can you say, I ate at this restaurant one time and it was bad, or the food was cold, so therefore every time I eat at that restaurant I should expect the same thing? No, that's not rational. So you can learn to identify that kind of thought, then you can try to see it for what it is and not let it control you. Another one that I've struggled with is called catastrophizing. Catastrophizing is kind of like you're thinking worst case scenario for everything. So like in my last video, if you saw, I recorded it while I was driving. So, and I've struggled with, anxiety for driving, right? And if you're catastrophizing that, then you're thinking, well, I'm afraid to drive because I'm afraid of whatever I think the worst thing is. So I'm afraid that I'll crash, or I'm afraid that I'll get lost. So when you catastrophize, you think worst case scenario for whatever it is that you're worried about. And the way that you overcome that is you have to tell yourself, you have to challenge the thought. You have to say, well, what if that does happen? What if it does happen? And am I prepared to do what I need to do to fix that? So with the driving example, like, what if I do crash? Okay, then what's going to happen? Well, I guess I'll call a tow truck, and I guess I'll get a the rental car or somebody to pick me up, and then I'll go home. And so the point is to combat the anxiety. You have to look for solutions, because anxiety is like, you're kind of like, you're spinning your wheels over and over again and you're not going anywhere. So to fight these thoughts is you have to challenge them, and you have to say, okay, what if this does happen? Then what? Or you have to ask, is this reality based, or is this helping me? And if you're saying no, that it's not helping you, no, it's not reality based, or I'm willing to accept the risk, then you're going a long way to help yourself overcome these thoughts. Then you just have to think new thoughts, but the process takes time. It really takes time. This is not an overnight thing. This takes a lot of time. Another one is shoulds and absolutes. You should be throwing up a red flag anytime you hear should, always, never. That is most likely maladaptive. Why? Some people would argue that there are absolutes, that there are things that are always and are never. I would argue there aren't. This life exists in shades of gray, as they say. Everything is nuanced. Everything is contextual, meaning everything is dependent on the situation, right? So if you could see it for what it is, that I don't always expect anything to happen. I'm always should be expecting change and exceptions to everything. If you can start to change your thought process to see the nuances, you'll go a long way in changing your thought process. I just briefly touched on it. I don't want the video to go too long, but I went over all or nothing thinking, which is where you very much have to be perfectionist. If you're not, then you're a failure. I went over global labeling, where one bad experience taints the whole category. One bad relationship taints all the relationships. I went over catastrophizing. I'm thinking the worst case scenario. And then I went over caution about shoulds and absolutes. So again, this is not something that you can change overnight, because your thoughts are ingrained, your brain forms neural networks for these thoughts. So it takes time for your brain to rewire itself, if you will. But I'm here to tell you that if you can identify some of this stuff, then you can kind of nip it in the bud, so to speak, before you let it even go through your mind. You can say, oh, I should be doing this. Oh, red flag. I just said should. Get rid of it. Catastrophizing. What's the worst that could happen? Well, hey, what is the worst that could happen? Is it a risk I'm preparing to deal with? Now, look, I should say one more thing about the catastrophizing. I should say that, part of what my job is I do risk assessment. So when you're a risk manager, a big part of the job is, you're trying to limit exposure to risk. And that's all you're really doing with catastrophizing. When you challenge it, you say, life is risk. Life is risk. So how do we mitigate the risk? It's not with anxiety. I've been guilty of saying I want to avoid risk entirely, but that's not reality. Not unless you want to live inside a bubble where you never leave. So it's about mitigating your risk. So like when I'm driving, like I said, we all know that when we get inside our car and drive, there's a risk of a collision. There is. But how do you mitigate the risk? Well, you drive defensively. You do everything you can to mitigate your risk. So if you can start to think along those lines in your thought process, you'll go a long way. You'll go a very long way. I hope this video helped you. Like or leave a comment. And I hope to post more videos about anxiety topics, and I hope that I help somebody today.